So the fiber optic infrastructure business, which when it started in Europe and the US, it started late in Africa. When it started, when they started deployment of this infrastructure, the interest of this infrastructure was basic, which is the connectivity, the broadband connectivity. Afterwards, the data centers business started to take place in the market, and then there were more need for this infrastructure, and it created more need for this infrastructure. And this is how it became a very strategic business and a very strategic decision to be taken by both governments and private sectors, and even by investors, to invest in both fiber optic and data centers. The thing is, in Africa, most of the businesses, they store their data in Europe and in the US. Recently, some companies, they started deployment of data centers, especially in South Africa, where the infrastructure was there. But in many other countries where they require to have a data center localized, they face the issue of the infrastructure. They did not have the proper connectivity, or maybe the proper electrical backups in order to deploy those data centers. And that was the main challenge that we are facing, and most of the companies working in this sector are facing. In Telecel Group, we work in a very tricky region, but we've chosen to work in that region, which is the Central African region. The Central African region basically has the lowest penetration rate in terms of connectivity in Africa. But at the same time, we found a huge potential in that region. And this is because of the location, which can connect both East African to West African region. And by the way, this is not only an African need, it's a global need, because most of the traffic which is being exchanged all over the world is being exchanged between two continents, which is Asia and America. And for that, you have to pass either through Europe or through Africa. And in case you want to pass through Africa, you have one choice. You have to go all the way down to South Africa, and then all the way up to the West Shores, and then take the route to the US or to the American continent. And this is where we found the opportunity. This is where Telecel Group is trying to develop an infrastructure which can create a shortcut for this traffic. But at the same time, for this shortcut, you need to build data centers along the way. We are already a mobile operator in Central Africa. This gives us the comfort to understand the requirements in the country, the legal requirements, the communication requirements, in order to deploy such infrastructure. We've already started building our data centers there. And we've already started deploying our fiber infrastructure. But definitely there are challenges, as just to answer directly your question. And the challenges are mainly in the deployment of the infrastructure itself. We have two types of challenges. One, which is the cost, because for putting a fiber in place in Switzerland, for example, you can use the electrical infrastructure, which will make it very easy to deploy hundreds and hundreds of kilometers in very short time. And the countries where we are deploying, we have to start from scratch. Even the infrastructure that we are building can be later used by electricity companies or other type of companies, but we are building from scratch, and this requires a long time for deployment. And the most important is it requires education for the communities and for the regions where those cables are passing. And for that, of course, Telecel, they communicate with the communities, and being a mobile operator, it makes it much easier for us to communicate with those communities in order to tell them what we are doing, what's the advantage of what we are doing, and basically keeping this infrastructure in good shape will help to develop your regions and your communities. And by that we are avoiding human intervention, I would say, that could cause damage for this infrastructure. The other type of challenge that we are facing is more on the regulatory side. Sometimes deployment of data centers and fiber infrastructure in the country itself could be easy, although it has some regulatory challenges. But I would like to focus more on the bigger scope here, since we are talking about crossing countries and so on. The main challenge that today we are facing is the connectivity between countries. So building a terrestrial cable and crossing borders is being a very big challenge for companies like us or other companies, because this involves lots of politics and lots of logistics and many parties' involvement and so on. And without this, I would say, framework that can regularize, that can actually organize the whole setup, we are facing lots of challenges to apply. So if we have, for example, a cable in Cameroon, which is already on the borders of Central Africa, and we have a cable coming from Bangui to the borders of Cameroon, we are facing the difficulty to do the 200 or 300 meters to connect these two cables together. And connecting these two cables together, by the way, this is just an example, we're not facing an issue with Cameroon, but connecting these two cables together will make a huge difference for both countries, because the people in Cameroon will have access to a redundant route and will have access to the data centers that are based in Kenya and Uganda and the east side of the continent. And the same applies for the people and companies and enterprises who are based in the east side, who will have access to the west side of the continent. So the impact is big, but to make it happen, it's not an easy job. You need to sit with both countries, and most of the time you need to speak to big organizations like the UN, for example, to help you in such settlement. And there's no regulations, or maybe there are international recommendations, but there are no international regulations that are yet in place to overcome this challenge, this main challenge also.
So on the challenges you face with regulation, we will have drill down on this in a few minutes. If we go back to the infrastructure itself, so you were saying in some countries there is an obligation to localize. Can you tell us a little bit more about localization, and this in the big picture of the global data center market? So what are we talking about here when we say we have to localize? How large are the data centers we are talking about in comparison with the infrastructure that you were describing in Europe or in Asia or in the US?
Yeah. So I'll start with an example in Central Africa. In Central Africa, building a data center is not justified economically. We will not have a return on our investment according to the figures today, in the next 20 years. However, the return on investment will depend on the potential figures and not on the current figures. Because when you build infrastructure in the country itself, you are creating an opportunity for both the government and the private sectors to develop their data. And as an example, if I want to suggest for the government of Central Africa to go for eGov, the main challenge for them to do that, they would require data centers. So once you have a data center in place, you are creating this potential for the government. And the same for the private sectors, and the same for new businesses or for startups. So basically, I wouldn't recommend anyone, if he wants to go into that direction, to look at the current figures. Because the current figures will definitely show you that this business is not feasible. But the potential is huge. Localizing the data center is required. Currently, most of the data in Africa is being stored in Europe, I would say. In London or in France or in Germany. But this data currently is not of that significance which requires to be localized. Once we start talking about topics like eGov, for example, none of the governments would allow their data to be accessed or to be stored somewhere outside the country. Unless if they want to do like type of a geographical redundancy, but then this requires certain political talks on very high level to secure this data. So there is a need for all the governments and for all those countries in Africa to localize the data centers because without localizing them, you are losing a huge opportunity in many sectors. You can, for example, store the data of for example, in the telecom world. We store our data, our African data, we store it in London. In Telecel Group, we store it in London. We can do that as a telecom operator. But there are many sectors that they wouldn't allow their data to be stored somewhere else. So it's either in their premises, like they have their own servers, or they could wait for having a local data center to store their data. And I'm talking here about governmental data, I'm talking about some banking data, insurance data, oil companies' data. So there are certain data that cannot be stored abroad. And this is where the opportunity is of building a local data center.
So what is the size of the investment we're talking about? If you take a country that has maybe 5-10 million people and e-government projects in the pipeline, how large is the investment for them if we are talking just about e-government related data centers?
Well, this all depends on the size of the country itself and the size of the potential itself. Now, with the development and with the technology, and with the companies focusing on that sector, the main manufacturers are basically focusing on how to provide affordable and flexible models for data centers. I'm not going to make advertisement here, but there are the big players are already doing this. For example, Huawei, they just launched a very nice model. I didn't check it myself, but the concept itself, it's nice. It's a portable data center. You can expand it as much as you want by need. And basically, the core itself wouldn't cost a lot of money, but it's affordable. With a basic investment, you can you can start a small business, I would say, on the size of a small business, you can start having a data center. But the cost of the data center itself is not the challenge, it's not the cost challenge. The main cost challenge here for data centers is basically the infrastructure, which will allow the connectivity, the infrastructure which will allow electrical backups, and the cost, the direct cost of the data connectivity and the electrical cost itself. So this is basically the key drivers of calculating the cost of the data center. The hardware itself, it's developing more and more. There are many solutions in the market. And I believe that they are affordable solutions. You can start building a data center even in a country where you have only maybe 3 or 4 banks to be your customers for the next 3 years. You can still afford it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've heard that, so colleagues on the